I want to just do a quick introduction. I'll leave the introduction of the panelists to my colleague Hussein Ibish, who is moderating the panel today. But I just wanted to bring your attention to this one piece of paper that you have on the chair in front of you, or under you, or next to you, which is a survey that I'd like you to fill. It'll only take you a couple of minutes to do. We are in the process of redoing our website, not a major rebranding, but a nice redesign that will make it nicer and more accessible. And we'd love to get your feedback. So if you do come to our events, if you do check our website, if you do read our blogs and papers, please just take a minute and fill this and just leave it on the chair when you're finished. We do have, if you don't have a pen on you, we have some pens on the side, so just raise your hand and we'll give you a pen. And a couple of additional things, please silence your cell phones before we start the conversation. And if you do tweet, and we encourage you to do so, please use the hashtag TrumpIran. We didn't do this on purpose. They just came out that way. But anyway, enjoy the discussion, and I'll leave this in Hussein's hands. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raymond. Welcome, everybody. So glad to have you here. Our topic today is the regional implications of Trump's Iran policies. And let me just begin by explaining what we're going to do. My colleagues and I on the panel will have a conversation about these issues, which I will shape by asking questions and adding, and I hope they will share with each other. And then after about 45 minutes or so, we'll bring you into the mix for questions and comments and whatnot. If you have questions or comments, if you have comments, please keep them brief. And as Raymond said, please do silence your mobile phones or anything else that makes noise. So let me start by introducing the panel. Here to my immediate left, Ambassador Susan Ziadeh, and we are really delighted to welcome her here today. She's a new non-resident fellow here at AGSIW, and she had a 23-year career at the State Department, extremely distinguished career, where she served as the acting principal deputy assistant secretary for Near East Affairs and the principal assistant secretary of state for Arabian Peninsula affairs, and before that, ambassador to Qatar, among other senior posts. And she's also now an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. So very distinguished, and we're delighted to have you. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
And then to her left, Paul Salem is the Senior Vice President for Policy Research and Programs at the Middle East Institute, and is a very well-known commentator, author of many important books and studies, and we're just delighted to have you here as well. And then, as well as old friends, we have a new friend with us. Ali Alfoneh is an Iran analyst who is usually based in Copenhagen, but I think more and more in Washington. He is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and the author of Iran Unveiled, How Revolutionary Guards is Transforming Iran from Theocracy into Military Dictatorship, which was published by AEI in 2013. So thank you so much for joining us as well. So what we're going to look at today is a specific angle, which is the regional implications, that is the implications for the rest of the Middle East of Trump's evolving Iran policies. And I think what we mean by that is that where this administration's particular take on Middle East policy seems to be not only distinctive, particularly when compared to the immediate predecessor, that's to say the Obama administration, but also taking shape not just rhetorically, but in terms of some real new policies or changes in approach, has to do with Iran, with the relationship with Iran. And I think it's fair to say that we've had, from the outset of the administration a year ago, a much tougher rhetorical stance towards the Iranians. But I think we've also seen that this tougher attitude and tougher rhetoric is starting to manifest in terms of actual policies. So, for example, the And also as reflected, by the way, in the national security strategy and national defense strategy documents, where there was some specific focus on Iran in those. In Syria, I think we see a deeper engagement now by the Trump administration. It's still very limited. It's still very cautious. But you've seen several instances of kinetic action that we did not see under the Obama administration. There appears to be an intensification of the U.S. engagement in Syria and a shift from a focus on defeating ISIS and preventing a resurgence of ISIS towards a real attention on Iran, Iran's long-term goals and strategy in the region, the potential for an Iranian-controlled land bridge running through Iraq and Syria to the Mediterranean Sea and Lebanon and Hezbollah. And that seems to be intensifying. It certainly saw at least a difference in intensity in the reaction to the Iranian protests in late December and early January than you did under President Obama a few years ago. And you could argue that they took fundamentally the same positions, but there was, as I say, there was an intensity about support for these demonstrations that were a little different. And in addition, I think it's fair to include the new campaign that's being rolled out by Treasury to sanction, isolate, and sanction Hezbollah and key Hezbollah leaders. That, again, seems to me qualitatively different from the previous administration. So we're going to look at what the implications of that policy change are for the region. And I'd like to begin by taking up an issue that is very important, but I haven't mentioned yet, so I'll segue directly into it, which is the Trump administration's antipathy towards the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, repeated threats to scrap or leave the agreement, and in other words, efforts to pressure Iran and the other 5 signatories to the JCPOA in order to augment it or change it or use that as leverage to affect Iran's other behavior. So I guess my first question, I'd like to see what everybody thinks about this, is the pressure regarding the JCPOA an effort to deal, is it mostly about the JCPOA, or does it factor in, and if so, how? I think it does factor in, but in my view, how does it factor into a broader reorientation of American policy towards Iran? I mean, it's clear where the difference on the JCPOA is. That's from, the signal achievement to the worst deal ever. That's pretty straightforward, right? But what about this broader agenda of containing and possibly rolling back Iranian interests in the region? And let me begin with Ambassador Ziadeh.
Okay. Thank you very much, Hussein. It's wonderful to be here. The JCPOA is coming under a lot of scrutiny now from the Trump administration and from others as well. I think I can speak a little bit from the Gulf states' perspective, because I think that's in part why I was asked to join this panel. And of course, if you go back to the Obama administration time, the Gulf states were not happy with the JCPOA. They weren't happy about being left out of it in terms of the negotiations. They weren't happy about what took place in terms of the secret meetings. I should qualify that, of course, Oman had a particular role to play in bringing the parties together. So they obviously were okay with it. But the other main actors, and that would include, I would have to say, not just Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which are the countries that maybe you would expect in Bahrain, but even Kuwait and Qatar were surprised by it and not particularly happy that all of this had been done without their knowledge, without their input. So I think you have to understand that from that position, they were already skeptical. In all the discussions that took place as the JCPOA was being negotiated with Iran, and we would meet as the State Department regularly once they became publicly known with representatives from the Gulf state embassies here in Washington, and we would brief them regularly, monthly, every 2 months. on what were the developments, what it was looking like, to the extent that we could, to try and bring them in. Certainly, the whole Camp David summits, the meetings with President Obama, the development of all of the working groups that are a whole range of issues that we were trying to do with the GCC to bring them on board, to assure them, to allay their fears, from things like ballistic missile defense integration with the GCC countries, from advanced and more enhanced joint military training, a focus on terror finance and how to work with Treasury and central banks to cut back on that. A whole slew of issues that were regular ongoing meetings with the GCC and then with the president every year to try and basically reassure these countries that, A, the deal will be good for you. We're not going to do anything that you will be unhappy with. I don't know why they thought that, but for some reason they did. And that we will, of course, take your interests and your concerns into account as this is all done. So this is sort of the backdrop to where we are today. Once President Trump came into office, I think the Gulf, and actually before, the Gulf states certainly saw an opportunity to reverse what they felt was an inadequate deal. I don't think I'm going to characterize it more than that, but let's just say an inadequate deal. Because for these countries, the issues that my other colleagues can certainly address more, the issues of malevolent behavior, training of paramilitary forces like the PMFs in Iraq, Hezbollah's behavior in places like Syria on the battlefield, arming of the Houthis in Yemen, et cetera, et cetera. It's a long case. That these were issues that they wanted to have addressed. And so now they feel they're at a place where this administration is looking at the JCPOA with a more jaundiced eye. And they see this as an opportunity to make their case and to see where the American administration is willing to go in terms of putting this situation back on a better footing. I'm not going to prescribe anything more than that, but let's just say
That's a terrific start. Thank you. Paul, what about a kind of broader regional perspective on this question of the relationship between the JCPOA and Iran's other conduct in the region? Yeah.
Well, I'd say, for the regional powers, what they're grappling with is the current status quo, as it were, where Iran has effectively won the entire Levant, one would have to say, has now also gained a serious foothold in Yemen. And if really one wanted to zero in on what are the major concerns for some of the regional players beyond the general, okay, Iran has influence, we don't like it, and so on, there are two that stand out in a very strategic way. One is the emerging missile capacity of Iranian proxies in Yemen, which for the first time reach Saudi Arabia. And the fear that they will double down on that and that Iran will have a permanent stranglehold on the strategic security of Saudi Arabia through a supposedly deniable proxy in Yemen. That is pretty much altogether new, but that is sort of existential. The other very acute threat that is emerging is, and flared up 10 days ago, was the Iranian-Israeli relationship in Syria. For the past 7 years, Israel sort of looked the other way, wasn't terribly concerned. It was, about events in Syria. Maybe they didn't sort of totally think it through. And they were probably okay with having Iranian proxies in the sense of local militia people carrying machine guns. That's not a strategic threat to them. But they're beginning to fear that Iran might indeed, as it did in Lebanon from the 80s and 90s, building in Syria a strategic presence to deter Israel, to threaten Israel, or whatever it is, meaning missile capacity beyond what they already have in Lebanon, anti-aircraft systems. They just downed an F-16. That hasn't happened for a very long time. That is a very, very, very major flashpoint. So I think that's sort of the reality that some of the regional players are living in. The situation in Iraq is of general concern, but doesn't threaten the Gulf directly or Israel directly. The unfortunate, tragic situation in Syria, again, cause of concern. But other than this potential strategic threat to Israel, it remains kind of a local concern. Now, in that context, when you look at Trump's emerging Iran policy, one looks at the various elements. The nuclear deal itself for the Gulf countries wasn't, I mean, the content of the deal wasn't so much the issue. It was, as the ambassador said, that they weren't consulted. They felt that the Obama administration was going behind their back or was building a kind of warm relationship. It was the alignment of the Obama administration, I think, that worried the Gulf countries. They did support the deal at the end of the day when it happened. Any delay to Iran's nuclear weapons program would be welcome. The Israelis had a different view of the deal, and they had a different position on it. So when you look at at Trump's potential policy towards the JCPOA, because it really hasn't been translated yet into action, I think it certainly gains sympathy in the Gulf countries because they feel, at least emotionally, if you want, as you said, Hussein, or rhetorically, Trump and many of the Gulf leaders are on the same page, and that's satisfying. For the Israelis, I think they're more focused on the nuclear program itself and breakout times, and any sense that they can get a better deal would be welcome in the technical sense. But I think what worries also people in the region, that the Trump administration approach to the JCPOA doesn't result in anything very substantial. It would result in the U.S. withdrawing itself from this deal. The Iranians, as according to them, will probably stay in the deal along with the Europeans, Russians, and the Chinese. It would isolate the U.S., particularly in the international community, when it needs more partners and allies to put other types of pressure on the Iranians. And it certainly doesn't stop the nuclear deal or force Iran to renegotiate. On the other arenas, which are of concern, like I said, when you go case by case, what Rex Tillerson announced in terms of a long-term stay in Syria potentially could be significant and beneficial to the Israelis if that's used sort of as leverage to make sure, or to try to pressure the Iranians in Syria not to build a major strategic asset. I think up till now the Israelis were relying on the Russians, and I think it's become clear that the Russians cannot deliver on that.
We're going to shift the focus to that angle in just a second.
But let me close just on Yemen.
Please do.
There's nothing new on Yemen.
There you go.
On the U.S. side of things, there's rhetoric. And, so, yes, there's something new in Syria, limited.
Definitely.
Nothing new on Yemen. And JCPOA doesn't have a clear outcome. And so far, the rest of everything is rhetoric and a few sanctions here or there, which suit the Hezbollah and IRGC, who don't want to be involved with the U.S. anyways.
Well, it's a very interesting question. So we have now a suggestion that the Treasury sanctions that seem to me quantitatively, if not qualitatively different, will be welcomed by Hezbollah and IRGC. And how does all this look, since you specialize in IRGC, how does it look, do you think, from their point of view? And how would you read it from that angle?
So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for your kind invitation. Thank you for providing me with this opportunity to share my analysis with you. Until now, the Revolutionary Guard strategy in Syria has been extremely successful. They have more or less achieved all of their strategic goals. Number one, they wanted to secure survival of the Bashar al-Assad regime. They have managed that. They have managed to do so with relatively small Iranian costs, which means that less less than 600 Iranians lost their lives in Syria. Most of those Shia militias who were killed were either Lebanese, Afghans, Pakistanis, or Iraqis. And third one, not to forget, Iran has managed to use Syria as a laboratory to create a transnational Shia militia, which can not only be used in Syria, but also elsewhere in the Middle East region. So these three things are very important. Number four, the Revolutionary Guards has managed to open up a permanent front against Syria, where there is no war, but also no peace. That makes the calculations of the Israelis much more complicated. If there is, let's say, a collapse of the JCPOA and some consideration about targeting Iran's nuclear program. So these things are on the positive side. These things work for the Revolutionary Guards. If we look at President Trump's new strategy, to the extent that there is a new strategy, and I still think we should wait and see if there is such a thing in the making.
Definitely.
It's going to have impact on the Revolutionary Guards because of several reasons. First and foremost, because Iran could achieve its strategic goals because of U.S. disinterest in the Middle East region and U.S. military disengagement from the region. In other words, Iran managed to fill a power vacuum. If the U.S. is interested in the Middle East region and is going to invest in the Middle East region, that of course changes the situation for Iran dramatically. Second, if there is U.S. interest in the Middle East region, the behavior of other players is also likely to change. We actually see it already with the Russians pursuing their own interests, which are not necessarily coinciding with those of Tehran's. That, of course, makes life much more difficult for Iran. And also, let's not forget that the Iranian strategy-making process has also to do with the power struggle in Tehran. Mr. Khamenei is not going to live forever, and the political elites of Iran are preparing themselves, positioning themselves for succession after Mr. Khamenei. So success or failure in Syria has also a lot to do with who will have the upper hand, making and processing and impacting the succession after Mr. Khamenei. If Revolutionary Guards is completely defeated in Syria, it would also lead to total loss of prestige within Iran, and it's going to impact their influence on who is going to be the next leader. So yes, it is going to be extremely important.
So, Ambassador Ziadeh, this is our conversation has brought us very clearly to Syria between Paul and Ali, and there's where we are. So I think the sort of the question is, I mean, is the evolving Trump administration's Iran policy going to have a significant impact on policy towards Syria? And if so, does that mean a sort of readjustment in the region as a whole, or is this all just going to sort of can it be isolated in a certain way? I mean,
From the U.S. perspective?
Yeah, from the U.S. perspective, from the point of view of U.S. policy. Yeah.
Can our policy towards
Syria be isolated from a broader? In other words, could you have a slight adjustment in Syria without adjusting everything else? And first of all, is there a new policy emerging in Syria because of a new policy to Iran? And if so, how does that, can it be isolated from a broader change in approach?
I'm not sure I think it can be isolated. I think Syria is the battleground. I mean, we can say that there are issues, I mean, as Paul rightly said, in Iraq, in Yemen, but those can be managed, and we have frankly been managing them at a distance, certainly in Yemen and in Iraq. Things are on a better keel right now, and what's even more important is that the Gulf states now are starting to reach out more to Iraq, and the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iraq, I think, is a very important development and is one to be noted that is in a way to try and counterbalance the Iranian influence. But Syria is a different case because it's really so wide open. The Russia piece of it is so important. It's true that we have tried and others have tried to get Russia to put the pressure to bear on Iran without a lot of success. But Russia is a signatory to the JCPOA. Russia does have a role to play that has longer strategic interests that I don't think will be put second to how Iran is playing in the Syria space. So I think that our ability to engage with Russia on this issue might be an area where we can find some overlap and some mutual agreeable ways forward in a way that we've been unsuccessful with Russia in other arenas. And I would argue that, I mean, I'm not being naive. I'm not taking the position of Russia is the solution, but I would not rule out that engagement as one piece of an important strategy.
Yeah. Can I ask you a follow-up? The Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia and Qatar, for most of the Syrian war, were pretty openly committed to regime change and to replacing the regime, and certainly replacing Bashar al-Assad. That the prospect of that appears to have diminished greatly in the short and medium terms. So, what do you think their goals are now in Syria, and is there a convergence between American aims and the aims of most of the Gulf states, or is there a difference that's going to be difficult and important? Can you talk about that relationship?
Well, I think that in terms of their wanting to have a regime change there, that has now been, I don't want to say put on the back burner, it's not being raised, just as we don't raise it. So I think in that sense, we in the U.S. and the Gulf are aligned on that. They have an understanding that this is going to be a long slog and that it may not come to fruition. I'm not sure they will say it, but there has to be a recognition that is the case. They still are supporting some of the opposition elements in certain pockets which hold sway. And I think that they would want to be able to support them in terms of localized areas of governance where perhaps the regime has not been able to take place and hold on to. But in terms of Iran, look, they're looking at the threat of Iran encircling, but also in the Gulf. And I think the immediate issue of what they're concerned with in the Gulf will outweigh where they're willing to go on the Syria issue. And on this point, I would note that maybe the Saudis and the Qataris see things slightly differently. In the sense that because of the tension between the two countries, perhaps Saudi Arabia feels a little bit freer to take a position vis-a-vis Iran, whereas the Qataris are a little bit more constrained given the fact that they're now depending upon Iran, at least for their airspace corridors, for their aircraft, among other things. It's not a warming of relations in my mind, but it's a practical necessity.
A constraint of some kind.
So there is some constraint there.
No, I see. No, thank you very much. So, Paul, how do you see that same question? I think it remains complex enough to continue to pursue.
The question.
The question of what do the Gulf countries want, and so what's their policy goal in Syria now, as a practical matter in the short and medium terms, not a long-term aspiration. And what about and how does that jive with the American approach?
Well, I would almost say, I mean, as a practical matter, they no longer have much ambition or influence in Syria.
Yeah.
It's kind of something that's passed for now.
Right.
The players in Syria, obviously, are the Assad regime, Iran and its proxies, Russia and Turkey, and now the U.S. because it's injected itself and wanted to be there. But even among the Assad, Iran, Russia coalition, as I said, Russian influence on Iran is extremely limited. I was at a track 2 last week in Berlin with a number of Russians. And over several sessions, they explained they need Iran in so many arenas that really their ability to influence Iran and Syria is, I wouldn't say negligible, but almost so. And the Iranians are hard nuts.
Was there any element of convenience about that? I mean, do you in any way think that it's an excuse, or do you think that they're just being completely straightforward? I have no opinion.
I mean, it's a mix of, maybe a little bit of a mix of both, but you take what happened just last week. The Russians did not have an interest for an Iranian drone to go
Yeah.
into Israel.
No,
That's
I
not
agree.
something they
Right.
would have agreed to.
Right.
And that was kind of a slap in the face from the Iranians that we will fly drones wherever we want next to a Russian base in Syria. And so that embarrassed them, and they were embarrassed that Israeli jets enter Syria and the Russians are put in a position, either turn on your S-400s or let it happen.
So two ways of looking at that, right? One is you could say, well, that just shows how dependent on the ground, especially the Russians are on Iran and its militias and Afghans and Pakistanis and Hezbollah and all. But you could also say, well, there's a divergence in interests and agenda between the twin pillars.
Well, there's a lot of
regime. Can that
yeah.
be worked with?
A lot of divergence. I mean, I think for President Putin, the interests in Syria, the naval bases are pretty significant.
Mm-hmm.
It's the only way that Russia can maintain a Mediterranean fleet in the 21st century. And I think that is, for Putin, for the military, something of signal importance. They certainly had sort of more broad interest to support state stability in the Middle East, to fight terrorism, and so on. That's sort of at a secondary level of interest. But I think, the bases and them having a presence and them having a say in regional and global affairs. Whereas for the Iranians, the presence in Syria, like their presence in Lebanon, is a desperate need for deterrence against Israel and the United States. Their relationship to the Assad family is completely, it's very solid in the sense that they know any other family, any other regime will not accord Iran as much leeway as Iran is accorded.
Yeah.
Whereas for the Russians, if some Syrian military general in a couple of years stages a coup and they do something, that's fine.
Yeah, fine.
So, yes, the interests are very divergent. Also, the Russians like to deal with regular army, regular air force. The Iranians are building up Hezbollahs and PMUs and things and similar units in Syria. They don't so much like to deal with that. Of course, ideologically, they're poles apart.
Well.
And they hate each other's guts for historical reasons. So, but I want to say one thing about Syria to comment on sort of how Iran's presence there and what's the future of it, that it's a sort of a bleeding victory. That it's, yes, it's a victory
So that's the question.
when compared to defeat,
Right.
but it's the only place where Iran will remain vulnerable for
Exactly.
many years to come, where it will be a drain. And the war in Syria is not going to end
Yeah.
because it simply, politically, it does not stand. So it's going to be an ongoing bleed,
Yeah,
which they
that's-
can afford.
But that segues
yeah.
exactly into what I was going to ask Ali to talk about for a second. Two things. Number one, how do you see the Russian-Iranian relationship in Syria? And is Iran overstretched in Syria? Is it vulnerable in Syria? Is this a little too much? And how do they see it? You and them, both.
So Iran-Russia relationship is like a love-hate relationship, more or less devoid of love. So there's a lot of distrust between
hate
Iran and
without
Russia.
love, yes.
There's a lot of distrust. External factors every once in a while bring Iran and Russia together, but at the end of the day, whenever it is in Russia's interest, they stab Iranians in the back, and Iranians, they just scream. This is just like the treaties of Golestan and Turkmenistan and all the historical reasons that you all know about. Now, let me give you one more recent example of how Russia has cheated Iran, and that has made a lot of anger in Tehran, also among the Revolutionary Guards officers. Concerning post-war reconstruction of Syria, in mid-January, the government of Syria and Russia, they created a consortium for rebuilding the country after the war. And now, if the Revolutionary Guards companies, or if any Iranian company wants to engage in post-war reconstruction in that country, they have to act as subcontractors to Russian companies. And of course, a lot of Revolutionary Guards commanders are saying, We have, sacrificed blood and treasure in this country. We have the engineering corps of the Revolutionary Guards. We have the Khatam al-Anbiya construction base of the Revolutionary Guards. We made all these sacrifices, and now we have to become subcontractors to the Russians. So this is one of the more recent examples of Russia pursuing its own interests and disregarding completely what may be in Iran's interest. Concerning the very, very, I believe, wise comment about bleeding victory of Iran, yes, definitely. If you listen to all of these slogans chanted against the government, in month of December, but also January, most of them were directed against Iran using money and resources in Syria, in Lebanon,
How
partially
popular
in
are
Iraq.
those objections?
Extremely,
How much support?
extremely popular, because the government of Iran, especially now that the Islamic State no longer exists, it is very, very hard for the state propaganda to persuade Iranian public that there is actually need for a good reason for using Iranian taxpayers' money in those places. So it's very, very hard for them. One of the few places where they have managed to minimize damage is by minimizing number of Iranians getting killed in the field. But when it comes to the economic issue, it's horrible for them, and it's impossible for the regime to explain why Iran is using its funds over there.
Mm-hmm. And so the consensus is shaky. Does that possibly reflect itself in policy? Could it reflect itself in policy, or is this just unless there is a massive upheaval, is it just a sociological phenomenon without policy implications?
It depends on how populistic President Rouhani is, because strategically, President Rouhani's idea and thinking is not very different than the Revolutionary Guards. For years and years, decades, he was the National Security Advisor, and the Supreme National Security Council, the chairman. So his strategic thinking is not very different. But now that he sees himself being attacked by the Revolutionary Guards, and now that he sees that the Iranian public is against Iranian public spending in Syria, he could make a shift.
Yeah.
And we have seen that kind of shifts in Iranian politics. You saw yesterday, former President Ahmadinejad has now become a champion of freedom and liberty in Iran. Nowadays, he's calling for free elections and fair elections in Iran.
Yeah.
So that kind of things happen, and I believe that Mr. Rouhani, too, could play the populist card.
That's really fascinating. Ambassador Ziadeh, we've talked about Syria, we mentioned Lebanon, we've talked a little bit about Iraq. We haven't talked about Yemen. And so the question really is the Trump administration moving in a new qualitative or quantitative new approach to Yemen based on its Iran policies? And might we see a greater convergence between the Arab coalition in Yemen and the United States, or is this? How do you think that's going to play out?
Well, up until now, I think we've had a policy which has been supportive of returning the legitimate government in Yemen back to power. But it's still been somewhat of a hands-off distance policy. We've done things, for example, like helping them with intelligence. We've done things like armaments. There was a holdup at the end of the Obama administration because there was concern about the death toll that was happening as a result of a lot of the bombings that were not always terribly strategic from the coalition's part. And there was a sense that we have to make them more accountable in terms of the laws of armed conflict and from a legal perspective as well. Now, under Trump, a lot of those barriers have been removed, mostly because of the closer relationship with the Saudi government and with the UAE, whereas the Trump government wants to be able to, we as an administration want to be more helpful to our allies. We are looking at it as we need them on board for a number of things. Our Iran policy is one. The Middle East peace issue, of course, is another big one that's sort of unspoken but is very much underneath the radar there. And of course, we want to bring humanitarian assistance to Yemen and get this sorted out, but the fear of Iran being there is overwhelming. But we have not taken a real hands-on policy under this administration. There were more efforts under the Obama administration, I must say, in terms of at least trying to engage with the parties to negotiate, to see what can be done. This administration has been overwhelmed, I think, with other issues, and the fight against ISIS has been the overriding issue. And now Iran in Syria, I think, has taken the full attention span. And so Yemen, I think, unfortunately, will continue to plod along in its way, will continue to support the government of Yemen and some of the fighting forces and the Saudi coalition partners in terms of trying to get Iran from supporting the Houthis. But at the end of the day, it has to be a political solution. And I think that we as a country can be doing more to help facilitate that political solution rather than assuming that the political solution can only come after victory on the battlefield.
Yeah. What about, let me throw another log on the fire, and then to get your take, and then we'll bring in Paul and Aliyah. The Israeli-Palestinian file also seems to be part of this mix for a number of reasons, and particularly the repeated suggestion by Trump administration officials that they want to take an outside-in approach, they want to bring Arab countries in. And the remarks attributed 2 weeks ago or so to Jason Greenblatt, the chief negotiator, that Palestinian, not necessarily objections, but reticence to get involved would not be a factor because it's going to be, as he put it, a regional understanding or something like that. So the question is, you can certainly understand that Arab countries and Israel share certain concerns about Iran, particularly in the kind of post-Aleppo environment where as the war in Syria kind of morphs and intensifies post-Aleppo and post-ISIS, that the Israelis are becoming more and more concerned about the same set of Iranian behaviors that the Arab countries have. At the same time, is there any basis for thinking that this nexus of Iran-centered policies can have any kind of major impact on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, on the U.S. policy towards that, and all of that stuff? Or is that just kind of wishful thinking? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think that's obviously the tactic they're taking. They are trying to get particularly the Gulf countries on board with a strategy, not just the outside in, but to come to terms whereby certain understandings would be agreed upon and then potentially then presented as a take it or leave it scenario to the Palestinian Authority. Now, to what extent these countries will buy on to this at the end of the day, I think is still untested. The fact that they're willing to go along and tease out some of the components to see where the U.S. administration will come out on this is, I think, possible. I suspect that, and I mean, I'm just thinking about this now, I suspect that some of these Gulf countries also think that with this administration, they have perhaps a better chance of getting the pressure put on the Israeli government because of some of the ties of individuals within the administration, like Greenblatt, like Kushner and others, to key actors in Israel, and that this might be one way of doing it. I'm not sure their confidence is well placed.
Paul, Yemen and or Palestine?
On Yemen, I mean, I think U.S. military concerns have been focused on the counterterrorism threats there, and they have ongoing operations, and on the naval issues in Bab el-Mandeb, and they've been active there and sending warnings to the Iranians that don't think of blocking the Bab el-Mandeb. As Ambassador Susan Ziadeh said, at the end of the Obama administration, Secretary Kerry was very active in the Yemen file and really tried hard to bring it to a negotiated end and came fairly close, I would say. There has been either no bandwidth or not much focus, neither from the White House nor from Secretary Tillerson, on Yemen as, the political side, the civil war and how to end it. I hope that, that will be addressed and that they will, at some point soon at least give it focus. But when you look at the details of the attempts at negotiation, I think we're still stuck in a hard place. The Houthis, in a sense, have won too much, and sort of they've grabbed too much and had too much success. So at the negotiating table, they're still, their demands are largely unacceptable to many of the other Yemeni factions, let alone to some of the Saudi concerns. So I think there's still a domestic Yemeni problem. But I think more critically, from the Iranian point of view, they are, I think, open to a solution in Yemen which creates a Lebanese solution, which you might call a two-state solution. That you have a state and then you have a state within a state. And that's effectively what the Houthis have been asking for at the negotiating table.
Question
We'll
is
be
how
part
big
of a
would it be?
government, but we keep our arms. We have a region which we control. The Iranians would support that. And the Saudis, of course, are completely not supportive. And when we've raised it with some Iranian officials, I sense no eagerness to give concessions or to push the Houthis to give concessions in Yemen, partly because it's a great, leverage over the Saudis and the Americans. So, I mean, a way to think about it is either the negotiation has to be broadened and that the Iranians might be convinced to give a concession in Yemen if they get something somewhere else. Now, nobody's putting that on the table. But that otherwise, I don't think there is an outlet soon in Yemen. On the so-called peace process, I mean, if there's a phase beyond dead, it's dead and deader and deadest.
Fully decomposed.
Fully decomposed. There is no peace process. There will be no peace process. There will be a long-term apartheid.
Which is what we have
the
now.
Arab countries will not and are not able to deliver a deal. They will work with Israel and Iran, and they already do.
So we can change the will be to is, and that's the way things are, and will continue to be. Okay, well that's correct. Yeah, so Ali, again, coming back to those factions in Iran that you've studied, and what's the relationship? Let me just sort of narrow the aperture a little bit. What is the relationship, from your point of view, that Iran has with the Houthis on the one hand and Hamas on the other hand? And how do they see situations of radically different, obviously, but how do they see Yemen and Palestine/Gaza as an opportunity or burden, or how do they view this?
I think it's very interesting if we compare the number of non-Iranians fighting and dying for the sake of Iran these years now, and the number of non-Iranians fighting and dying for the sake of Iran in the 1980s. The comparison is very interesting because back in the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq war, less than 3,000 non-Iranians were killed. And they were fighting on Iran's side. They were wearing Iranian uniform. The largest majority of those people were Afghans, who were Afghan poor immigrants, who came to Iran. They became soldiers. Their families were granted either asylum or residence permit, and they had a source of income. There were very, very few Bahrainis, a couple of Kuwaitis, a couple of Emiratis, but in reality it was, more or less 3,000 Afghans, and then a few Lebanese and some people from the Persian Gulf region. If you look at the numbers today, and I study them every 12 hours, I take a look at the funeral services held in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Iran, you see that very, very large number of people die. And that tells me that there is an infrastructure within Iran training people, including Yemenis. If you take a look at theological seminaries in Iran, theological seminaries are like the Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow. They are training revolutionaries. The Houthi leadership, all of them were trained at theological seminaries in Qom. And by the way, if you take a closer look at those theological seminaries, you find out that there is a degree of compartmentalization between them. In other words, there is one school for Yemenis, there is another school for Lebanese, there is a third school for Iraqis. They do not get together unless they get to higher levels of education.
This is the Lumumba model again.
Exactly. So if there is one defection, if there is a defector, that person cannot compromise information about the entire operation. So as long as you have relatively large group of people getting an education, military and political training and indoctrination in Iran, they not only are operatives, they also pursue their own national goals, which means that they become a pressure group within Iran, pushing Iran to work towards a specific goal.
Yeah.
Again, if you compare with the situation in the 1980s against Iraq, one of the main reasons why Iran continued the war against Iraq was because of the power of Shia Iraqi immigrant communities living in Iran. They were using all their political influence to force Ayatollah Khomeini to continue the war. And the Iranian machinery of state did not mind. But the immigrant communities have a logic and a dynamic of their own. And I believe that this is also the case today with the Yemenis, with some Syrians, with some Iraqis, and this will continue for a very long time to come. So your counterpart is not just, let's say, Mr. Mohammad Javad Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran. Your counterpart is not even just Revolutionary Guards. The picture is much more complex, and we need to develop better models of understanding how the system works.
That's extremely interesting. I want to start to move to bring the audience in, but I'd like to ask at least one question to all of you at the end. I might throw another one depending on how it goes. Just to be very specific, the next deadline is coming up in a few weeks. Do we expect the Trump administration to withdraw from the JCPOA as he has threatened? Or what do you expect the administration to do in the short term regarding the JCPOA, and what impact do you think that would have? I'll begin with Ambassador Ziadeh.
I don't expect us to withdraw. I do think that there will be some questions of potential amendments, or shall we say tightening in terms of the execution or implementation of those things that are already in the JCPOA. Let me give you an example. In the JCPOA is a piece that talks about the inspection regime. And I suspect that we will be looking to make sure that inspections is not just for the nuclear sites, whether we're talking Fordo or Natanz or the Iraq heavy water facility, but that we will be saying there could be potential other sites, military sites, where there could be activity, and that we should be able to have access to all sites. Because the language, I think, is not, I'd have to go back, but I'm not sure the language is exactly specific on that. So I think they're going to try and widen the aperture on that one in particular. I think that the administration will be playing a little bit of a longer game if they can get the president to see the importance of a longer game. In the short run, if you want to be able to get support from the street for questions about the IRGC and questions about the leadership in Tehran and the economy, the easiest way to do it is to walk away from a deal then that says, oh, the bad Americans, and we're not going to deal with them, and give the leadership a cause célèbre.
Right.
And that's the last thing you want to do. And the other thing I would say is we would have to think very carefully about what's our position vis-a-vis the Europeans, because if the Europeans stay in the JCPOA, then are we going to reconsider our position with the Europeans when it comes to their companies doing business in America, like Siemens or Airbus or any of those? What about our banking corresponding relationships with European banks working with American banks? These are all issues that I think are going to be important for us to look at, because at the end of the day, Iran wants to get reintegrated into the global economy. So how do we get them to move to do what we want, understanding that's the lever?
So can the JCPOA actually be used as leverage for that? Or, I mean, or is it just a very bad tool? Is it potentially effective?
It's the tool we have.
It's the tool.
So we should be looking at, if this is our decision of how to go forward, how do we use it more effectively and not lose our allies on the side and not give the Iranians a win?
Great. Paul, do you have a quick comment on what do you expect?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think we're
figured.
already in a new place. That the deal that was made under the Obama administration and kind of the policy within which it was made is gone. That already this administration hasn't withdrawn from it, but signals that it's opposed to it. The signals sent to Europe are very negative. The Europeans are really not investing in a big, they've sent many delegations, but not much has come of it. That's partly because of worries about the U.S. administration now, I mean, regardless of whether it technically withdraws or not. So from the point of view of Iran and the nuclear deal, that it would bring investment and integration and growth and jobs, that isn't happening. And it's not happening partly because of the U.S. position, but partly because it's almost impossible to invest in Iran, given the levels of corruption and so on. So that's not happening. And the idea that the nuclear deal would be a gateway for a thaw in U.S.-Iranian relations, that's already gone.
Yes.
So we're already in this new place, and the deal is kind of, I wouldn't say dead, but it's half dead already. So a full withdrawal is not going to change much in the status quo, but it will isolate the U.S. further and weaken it when it wants to raise issues like sunset clauses and missile defense.
You expect not, then?
I don't know what to expect of Donald
fair
Trump,
enough.
but I would say
Okay.
the leverage we have would be to keep the JCPOA and then build on it,
Sure.
not the reverse.
Okay, and let me ask Ali, following up on Paul says we're in a new space, and we are. And so the last question I have for you is, does the ruling faction in Iran, and especially RGC related, but the ruling faction in general in Iran, they perceive they're dealing with a qualitatively different American policy? Or do they think they're dealing with the same old United States without it really doesn't matter and they don't have to adjust? How do they perceive Trump versus Obama?
Well, I think that most analysts in Tehran, regardless if they are belong to the technocratic faction of President Rouhani or to the Revolutionary Guard, they are trying to understand President Trump, just as we are trying to understand him.
It's universal.
They're trying to understand if there is a strategy, or if there is no strategy. They want to know if President Trump is just talk and combative rhetoric, but not really so much in action. So they I think they are preparing themselves for an era with a lot of uncertainty.
So it's to be determined.
Yes, certainly.
Okay. Great. And so then I've asked the last question before bringing the audience, the same thing more or less to you, Ambassador Ziadeh, from a more American point of view. Do you think we're moving towards a substantively different approach towards Iran regionally, and one that might be more consistent with the hopes of the Gulf countries, or is this fundamentally is the United States approach going to remain more or less the same as it has been?
As it has been since.
Under Obama and
No,
under the second term Obama, let's just put it that way.
No, I think it's a different approach. Certainly in temperament and understandings and assumptions, it's different. I think in some ways under the Obama administration, in our quest to get a nuclear deal, which was important and does have certain provisions that everybody agrees are good things, even if maybe in the totality not everyone is in agreement on the whole deal. Perhaps we were not as aggressive on certain things as we could have been. I mean, there are always those calculations, and I would argue that maybe some in the administration might deny it, but the fact is that you always have to do the trade-off, and there may have been trade-offs that we are not as aware of, but that did take place. I think that this administration feels they have strong partners across the board in terms of the Gulf countries, Israel. It's unclear where a country like Turkey will come out on this, and I think that's a factor that we are not in the position really right now to have a good understanding with, because our relations with Turkey are so strained right now. But that we need to be thinking about, if we move forward, how we have all the pieces on board in terms of these state actors. We have more folks coming together on a range of issues. And by the way, the Europeans, of course, are still a big wild card. We don't know where that's going to come out.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. Turkey's own policies are obviously in some degree of flux as well. I'm going to bring the audience in now. I just want to remind you that if you are tweeting about this event, it is #TrumpIran. And so we'll begin. First question, Ambassador Katouf here, and then Dan, and we'll go around the room. But we'll begin with Ted.
Ted Katouf. the U.S., as I understand it, has about 2,000 military personnel in Syria on the ground. I'm not sure because I don't follow this thing day to day.
The minimum figure.
But, you know, intelligence, logistical, trainers, I don't know,
Special
forward, air traffic, or not air traffic, but spotters and the like.
Yeah.
And the view I'm going to give you is not, as they say, necessarily my own, but it is the view of several people I highly respect,
Yeah.
both former military and former U.S. diplomats who know a lot. And they would say, we have just enough presence in Syria to get ourselves into trouble and not enough to really affect the outcome of everything. And they would say, better we get out than at least physically get out. That doesn't mean we can't have airstrikes or we can't have missile strikes and the like, than be in a country in which Russia, Iran, Turkey, the Syrian regime, and all their allies want us out.
Right.
So we're the most likely to get voted off the island by a lot. But there really is a serious issue here.
Oh,
We
yeah.
lost people, you know, the Iranians
Sure.
never struck us directly in Iraq, but we know they're responsible for killing a number of our people.
Quite a few.
Et cetera. And Russia just got a bloody nose. It's militiamen
Yep.
there, and there may be a time for payback. There usually is. So I'm wondering, in view of all this,
Yeah.
okay, that, you know, and finally, I would say Citizen Trump used to say, what are we doing in all these Middle East imbroglios,
Right.
and why aren't we focusing on our own country? And
Yeah.
So, having said all that, how do you see it? Should we just continue on the path we're on, or do we need something significantly different?
Is this for the whole group, or is it for Ambassador Ziadeh in particular? Or?
Well, it's really for the whole group.
Okay. Does anybody want to take that on first, Paul?
Well, first of all, I would say it's not clear to what degree President Trump is deeply on board with this policy. From what I know, the policy was presented to him many, many times. He rejected it every time until in one meeting he accepted it. So clearly there's reluctance, and as you indicate, I don't think he's interested in the details. It's a very complex thing that they're putting forward. I think it's driven kind of by the military itself for a number of considerations. One, they don't want to abandon their Kurdish allies. These are especially special ops people. They fought together. They beat ISIS, a great victory. There's blood there, and I think the idea of leaving to these soldiers on the ground was poor. I think there's also a strategy of keeping an eye on ISIS and any return, that they want to stay there to keep an eye. They don't want to make Obama's mistake. Thirdly, the military and others are focused on Iran as well, and they feel that if they stayed, they might have some leverage on the Iranian presence. Their presence there is not only a military presence, they're also sitting next to a lot of the oil fields and the agricultural territory, and they feel that leverage is on the Assad regime and on Iran, that they can certainly not stabilize, normalize, or even think of reconstruction if they don't have those oil fields and those agricultural areas. So they feel they have leverage. My fear is that this policy has very thin support with the president. So at the first sign of something happening, some attack, some loss of life, American public opinion will say, where the hell is northern Syria and why are we there? The president might pivot and we're out of there. That's probably worse than going out in an organized way.
You think so? Either of the other panelists want to comment on that? Okay, we can go straight to Dan. Thank you so much for coming. Good to see you.
Ted and I were headed in the same direction, but I'll recast a little.
Sure.
The question is, well, I do think the changes have been more rhetorical than anything else. With the exception of this presence on the ground inside Syria and the possession of the oil wells.
Yeah.
So the question is, what would Trump do? But what would a good American policy of pushing back harder on Iran regionally, which is what a lot of people want us to do, what would a good policy of that sort consist of? And would it include some use of these troops on the ground in Syria?
Okay, very good. And I'm going to have a version of that for you in a second, but I would like to ask Ambassador Ziadeh if you have any thoughts about what a preferable stratagem in Syria might entail.
Well, I would be able to answer the question that we've been battling with since the whole revolution began. I think to be able to keep our allies close and make sure that there are no missteps is going to be a very important thing. We've got to be able to push back on Iran in areas even outside of Syria. For example, the Iraq piece, I think, is very important. So many of the fighters came across the Iraqi border. That space that has been captured, taken back from ISIS, has to be held, as Paul has rightly said. These are areas where I think we can try and make a difference. But in terms of having to deal with all of these different pieces, which is very difficult, we have to make sure our focusing on the Turkey relationship, I think, is going to be a big issue that we should be putting more energy into sorting that out, because I think the Kurdish issue hamstrings our ability to be more effective in that area in the north, and the Turks can be helpful to us on that. And I think we don't have an ambassador there. Our relations are really at a pretty low ebb. And I think that shoring up those alliances to have more partners to be able to help us, I think, is an important first step.
Very wise. Thank you. Ali, from let's say, what would some elements of an American strategy that promoted positive political developments in Iran look like? I mean, how could the United States behavior in the region, in Syria and elsewhere, have a beneficial impact on Iran's policies and conduct? That's sort of the way I would put it to you.
So first of all, I think Washington needs to have a strategy.
That would
You
be
need
good.
to have a goal and a strategy, some tactics, so you know how to achieve your goals. Then I also think that it would be beneficial to the U.S. to engage in some degree of Machiavellism. Is Bashar al-Assad really that bad? What if Bashar al-Assad is given a chance to do deals with the U.S.? Can U.S. do deals with Russians so Russia once again abandons Tehran?
And there is a deal with al-Assad, the chemical weapons deal. So, no.
But seriously, there are things that Washington can do in order to contain the problem that it has with the Revolutionary Guards and with the Islamic Republic. But I do not see so much creative thinking in Washington. To be completely honest with you, I do not see so much thinking at all, let alone creative thinking in this administration.
But let's say we put you in charge. What would you suggest? And with the point of view of having a good impact on Iran.
Sure. So when it comes to Syria, I would say that, Bashar al-Assad is fine for me. Let him survive. We give him guarantees. Why should his survival depend on Tehran? We give him all the guarantees. In return, Mr. Assad should guarantee that the overland corridor from Tehran, to be honest, from western Afghanistan to the Mediterranean is closed. Why not?
Yeah.
Why not? I'm not sure you can do something similar with Lebanese Hezbollah, but with Syria you can certainly do things, because the Syrian government and the regime, I don't think they are particularly ideologically, inclined towards the Islamic Republic, and they certainly do want to be independent from Tehran.
Is that so far from the current approach, though? It sounds to me like we have the makings of that right now. Almost, So.
In that case, there is much more thinking in Washington than I.
Well, I might be wrong. Okay, and so that's one. Assad can stay, but Iran's entrenchment can't. That would be one approach. Anything else quickly?
So next you have to deal with the developments inside of Iran, because right now we have two factions and there is succession after Mr. Khamenei. You really need to think about who you want to be in charge of Iran.
This is what I had in mind.
And in this context, I believe that the United States should think if Iran as, let's say, a government ruled by a technocratic elite group is better for the U.S., or Iran being a military dictatorship run by the Revolutionary Guards. Once U.S. has made up its mind, you can engage in policies which promote the interests and increase the chances of a specific faction within the ruling elites of Iran to take over control.
Yeah. Very good. Okay, great. Next question, we have Ambassador Wahbe here, and then we'll move to the back.
Thank you. Thank you for a great panel. If we all agree that the so-called emerging policy of the Trump administration towards Iran will focus on the Syria piece, the two parties that are involved in Syria that have, I think, the most in common, I would argue, would be Israel and the United States in terms of how they see the threat in Syria, whether it's the Islamic State and now the growing presence of Iran and Hezbollah. So to what extent are the U.S. interests and Israeli interests 100% the same? To what extent should we or could we coordinate? And then how can the U.S. leverage what we're doing in Syria to influence Israel on the peace process? I know it's a bit convoluted, but I'm trying to connect the dots because I think there is a connection.
Is that for anyone in particular or whoever wants to? Okay, great. Yeah.
Well, I think U.S. and Israel in Syria, yes and no. I mean, ISIS was not really a concern of Israel. It was the number one concern for the U.S., and I think that's a big part of the reason they're staying, to keep an eye on that. And the Iranian strategic threat to Israel is a concern for Israel. And because it's a concern for Israel, it becomes a concern of the United States. Not that it's actually a concern directly for the United States. So it's an interesting situation. But I think that brings us to, so part of the question that Dan was asking, from the U.S. perspective, the Iranian presence, this and that, is not all of a par. It's not all, we must roll back everything, and there's no capacity to do that. That's why, like when I started my remarks, it's what are the key issues that you're trying to stop Iran from doing. Iran is going to be in Syria for the next, God knows how much longer, and we're not going to be able to change that. Right. But what the U.S. and Israel are concerned about, that it doesn't use that to build strategic, and that I think is leverage and a focus that the U.S. can use its presence to do. It's not easy, but I think that the presence in Yemen, again, the general presence is maybe not a huge concern, but if they use it for missiles on Riyadh, that's the red line. And there are areas where Iran has been helpful and can be helpful. I mean, Iran helped Baghdad and Erbil, not fall to ISIS. We're concerned about their presence, but they're part of the, situation there. I do think the Iranians are going to have to be part of some resolution in the medium term in Syria. I mean, the problem, I may disagree a little bit with Ali here, is that Assad cannot rule Syria. No matter how many people try to help him, it's gone too far. He cannot govern Syria. And that's a problem for the Iranians, for the Russians who want to consolidate their gains. So at some point, they might be part of some way to move forward. At this point, nobody can see how that would happen. But Assad cannot manage the situation.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I would just want to add one point. I mean, if you look at the border historically between Syria and Israel, it's been the quietest border historically. And the Assad regime, whether it's the father or the son, have really been pretty good about maintaining that border. So the fact that, as Paul rightly says, that Assad doesn't have control over all of those areas. And there are pockets in the south where you have opposition. There are pockets where you have ISIS in the south.
Yep.
Those areas are particularly of concern to Israel. The other thing is when you talk about bringing it back to the peace process, for the Syrians, that means the Golan. And that, for the Israelis, I think, is a very different issue than looking at the West Bank and how we divvy up these Bantustans and this Swiss cheese apparatus that they make in the West Bank. The Golan is so strategic to them that I think any idea that there would be some give with any regime in Syria, even one that has historically kept the border quiet, I think is a stretch.
Okay.
Especially now.
All right. So we'll go to the gentleman here and then over there. So right here.
Thank you. My name is Ahmed Saidi from the Oman Embassy. I'm going to digress a little bit and ask about please don't ask the question as if it will not break up. in case the GCC countries break up as a result of what's going on right now, how would you envision the relationship between then will be Gulf states and Iran, and how will that impact the relationship
So
between?
the question is, if there is a real rift, a formal rift within the GCC, how
Well,
would that affect relations with
If
Iran?
you want to use
correct?
rift, yes, I'll use breakup. I mean,
Okay. Oh, okay. Good.
Okay,
I
thank
got the
you.
question. So, who would like? Go ahead, please.
I mean, okay, it might formalize something, but by the same token, the GCC countries historically have not been on the same page vis-a-vis Iran. Their relations are different. Your country, Mr. Minister, is one of the best examples of a very different relationship with Iran, which is more cordial. It has stronger working relations. It has ties that have actually helped us in the United States at time when we needed to get something done, and your government has been helpful. If you go across the other GCC countries, you see countries that have I don't want to say warmer relations. I think the other countries are still correct relations. Even Qatar or Kuwait are correct relations, but they are able to engage a bit more, whereas other countries like Bahrain, for example, will have much greater concerns about Iran. So, you know, even in the meetings that we used to have with the GCC, there were lots of different back and forth about what, as a collective, people were willing to do. And we found that each country basically goes its own way. So the status quo now is basically, I don't want to say a rift, because I think there is cooperation within the GCC on a lot of economic issues and security boundary issues. There is. But in terms of relations with Iran, I'm not sure there's going to be that much that is new. It's been that way for quite some time.
Ali?
Well, yes, sir, I agree, and I also see the tendency that, you know, the Islamic Republic, but even before that, you know, the Shah's regime, they prefer to deal with smaller states, you know, for example, dealing with you know, government of Dubai or government of, you know, the Ras Al Khaimah, or, you know, rather than dealing with the government of United Arab Emirates, you know, during the Shah. You know, the same thing with the GCC. You know, Tehran always tries to play on the differences between the two the countries within the GCC. So it makes sense from Tehran's point of view that, you know, the Arab Gulf countries are divided. It benefits.
Okay, very helpful. Thank you. We're going to go to you, and then over there.
Hello, Horatio Ureta, retired from the State Department. I want to follow up on my previous boss, Ambassador Duke's question on basically U.S. presence in Syria. How's the U.S. presence in Iraq? In other words,
Okay,
the training
good
missions
question.
we're keeping there post-Daesh, which will be rather significant, that at least the Iraqi army and Prime Minister Abadi recognize as important as an irritant to the Iranians.
That's-
How is the U.S. military presence in Iraq part of the formula or the
That's a great question. We've talked about Iraq a couple of times. Ambassador Ziadeh, you brought up the Saudi diplomatic initiative and outreach to Iraq. But what about where the interests of the Gulf countries in Iraq and then the American, especially military presence? You know, how does that drive policies on both sides?
In terms of Syria or in terms of Iraq?
Iraq.
Oh,
And the
Iraq.
U.S. policies in Iraq, and
Well,
how does
I
that
don't-
influence the Gulf interests?
I think Gulf interests are well served by having a U.S. military there. And I think that's been proven by the work that the trainers and the advisors have done in terms of the fight against ISIS. And not only in terms of improving the performance of the Iraqi military, but a better integration of forces. And even when it was a difficult situation in terms of pushing back in Mosul and in the north in Erbil, with the ISIS forces and the role of the PMFs that did play a military role, still we were able to manage that in a way that didn't take away from Iraqi's military position and their integrity and their sovereignty. And I think that was an important role that we were able to play.
Well, thank you. And we have another question right there. Gentleman in the blue shirt. And
thank you very much. If I may be blunt,
you may.
thank you. I'm not sure I agree with the ambassador's contention that the United States must be very careful to keep allies in line as regards Iran's policy. In particular, Europe, if I understood you correctly. I believe that perhaps there's a divergence, there has been a divergence of interest between the United States and Europeans as regards Iran. Iran has one of the richest gas fields in the world. It has a lot of oil, it's a huge market. And now it's kept United States out for 40 years, and European companies are filling in the gap by and large. So why should the Europeans help United States get back into the Iranian market? They don't want Iran's nuclear program to go forward because it's a threat to Europe. So they go with the United States to contain Iran's nuclear program, but they don't want this to go as far as changing the circumstances on the ground to the degree that the United States is back in the game inside Iran.
Okay.
So I want, if you could comment on
the
that.
question
Thank
is
you.
clear, and then if I can add just a little spin, if there is a divergence between the U.S. and Europe, most European countries, Western European countries, that is significant, how does that affect the calculations of the Gulf countries? Just add that to it. Anybody care to?
Well, I would just
Please.
mention the fact that, for example, you see the UAE foreign minister wrote a piece about 3 weeks ago in the Financial Times questioning the JCPOA. He was addressing it to the European Union.
Yeah.
And that was a very clear signal that we understand where the Americans are and we're on board with their thinking. And now the Europeans, we need you to take a look at what revisiting this would mean. It doesn't talk about abrogation, but he talks about revisiting in a way that could potentially strengthen or broaden it that would serve some of the Arab Gulf states' interests. Now, with regards to the economic issue, I would agree with you. I would not say that our allies are their interests in terms of economic issues. They're our competitors. But when it comes to security and when it comes to Iranian behavior that is malevolent and interference in surrounding states or states that are not even so nearby, I think the Europeans are on board with us. So my point was that if we want to be able to affect change, the extent to which that we have allies on board and we can take into concern their considerations, and in this case, I think Turkey is a big factor, plus the EU, plus being able to leverage a country like Iraq, which has those common borders, which are hugely important in terms of movement of people and material, are important factors that we need to be able to focus on and shore up.
Okay, very good. One final question, if you like. We have several people. Why don't we go over here? Shift the focus over here, just for proximity balance.
Asif Kangat, BCG.
Louder, please.
Asif Kangat, BCG. So my
Much
question is, the U.S.-Iranian relations have been always an issue.
Excuse me. Thank you.
U.S.-Iranian relations have always been an issue of trust. Is there capacity within the Iranian system, political structure, that would allow for this trust to be built? Because during the Obama administration, the U.S. demonstrated plenty of efforts of goodwill. It was never reciprocated.
So
is there capacity within
got it.
Iran itself, within be it the reformer group, the more moderates, the
No, we have
whatsoever,
your
that will
question.
allow for some form of
Gotcha. Reconciliation,
reconciliation
war,
or an
okay.
addressment.
That's a
given
good
the
question,
baggage.
and we did talk about the idea that that the JCPOA might have been able to help to promote that, but it didn't. So the question is then, and understanding this was one of the big fears, the biggest fears of the Gulf countries, was that there would be some kind of rapprochement without Iran changing its policies. So then the question is twofold. Number one, is there space for anything like that with Iran's policies continuing to be the kind that cause a great deal of stress and concern to the Gulf countries? And where's the scope for a new dialogue with the United States here? Is it contingent on Iran changing its behavior or not? That's the question. So, yeah.
Well, I think the tragedy is what remains of the revolutionary nature and character of the regime. Because as soon as there is one faction trying to negotiate with somebody like Mr. Alfoneh from the State Department, there would be somebody else accusing those Iranian negotiators of being American spies. Right now, we have several Iranian Americans who are arrested by the Revolutionary Guards intelligence agency, intelligence organization, accused of espionage for the US. And that, of course, has always been the tragedy of Iranian politics. That is a terrible mechanism within the revolutionary governments. We hoped for many, many years that there would be a maturing of the regime, that we would be over this kind of immature behavior and characters and characteristics of this type of regimes. But unfortunately, that time apparently is not over. And as long as there is no clear, one faction ruling over Iran, either the Revolutionary Guards or the technocrats, unfortunately, this mechanism is likely to continue.
So I realize that the question can be focused even more clearly, which is, do the Gulf countries have a reason to worry that there could be a warming between the United States and Iran without Iran fundamentally changing the policies that scare them so much? Or do the experiences of the JCPOA and some other recent interactions suggest that is simply not possible, and that the two changes to the policies that are objectionable and rapprochement are contingent on each other? And how do you see that?
As a closing remarks, I think in a way the Revolutionary Guards and the Trump administration have a similar vision of the Middle East. And that is that Iran and its proxies will be implacably at war with the U.S. and its proxies. In that context, although the Gulf countries welcome that sort of rhetoric and that positioning, certainly the Gulf countries do not have to fear, with this administration, a rapprochement. They might have to fear, if things get worse, the risk of a more serious escalation because they live there and the U.S. doesn't. But I think that's the extent of it right now. I just want to end my own comments by saying that, to my mind, the long-term strategy for the Middle East should be, for the U.S. and many other players, an integrated Middle East, where Iran and Turkey and the Arab countries and Israel are part of a regional order where their national security is guaranteed collectively, in a sense, respected. That's where we need to get to at the end of the day. That vision does not sit well with the Revolutionary Guards, and it does not sit well with this administration.
Thank you. Ambassador Ziadeh, any thoughts on this or additional closing comments?
Well, I just want to echo what Paul just said. The mentality of the zero-sum game is something that has unfortunately seized our administration, and it is also something that in the region, because our administration sees things in these terms, it has brought out, I think, in certain countries, some of their worst instincts. And this is really troubling to me, because I agree that, economically and strategically and security in every way, it's going to have to be integrated. And the issues do have to be sorted out with, sort of integrity for all the peoples of the region. But if it's either us or you, then the ability to move forward on that is going to be more difficult. So I think we should challenge this mentality, frankly. That would be my suggestion.
A very good note on which to close, and thank you so much. Join me in thanking our panelists. Excellent. And look forward to seeing you next time at another AGSIW forum. Thank you.